Great. Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm really excited to welcome you to our virtual panel, Who's Who Latinx, sponsored by Washington University Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity, and organized by the Latinx and Latin American Research and Race and Ethnicity Research Unit. My name is Ariella Schachter, and I'm an assistant professor of sociology here at WashU. I have the pleasure of moderating our panel this afternoon, and I'm going to begin by introducing our distinguished guests. So first up, we have Graciela Mochkofsky, the Latino Media Initiative Director of the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. She joined CUNY in 2016 as the first director of its bilingual journalism program, and is also the executive director of the Center for Community Media. A native of Argentina, she is the winner of the 2018 Maria Morris Cabot Prize for Outstanding Reporting across Latin America and the Caribbean, and has worked as a professional journalist in South America and the United States. She's currently a contributing writer to The New Yorker, and has been a political correspondent with La Nación in Argentina, a columnist and blogger for El País in Spain, and a contributor to publications in Latin America, Europe, and the United States. She's the author of 6 nonfiction books in Spanish, 2 of them about the relationship between press and political power in her home country, and her forthcoming book, The Prophet of the Andes, about a Peruvian Catholic community that converted to Orthodox Judaism and emigrated to the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, will be published in English very soon. I'd next like to introduce Cristina Mora, an associate professor of sociology and Chicano Latino studies, and the co-director of the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley. Her research focuses mainly on questions of census racial classification, immigration, and racial politics in the United States. And her first book, Making Hispanics, was published by the University of Chicago Press and provides the first historical account of the rise of the Hispanic or Latino panethnic category in the United States. Her work has received numerous awards, including the Best Dissertation Award and Early Career Award from the American Sociological Association, and has also been the subject of various national media segments in venues like The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and NPR. In April 2020, she helped oversee the largest survey of COVID-19 and racial disparities in California and published some of the state's first briefs and academic articles on this subject. She's currently working on her next book, California Color Lines, which examines contemporary racial attitudes in politics in California. Her work has also been published in venues like the American Sociological Review, American Review of Sociology, and other fantastic journals. And in 2020, she received the Graduate Mentoring Award from the Academic Senate, and in 2022, the Chancellor's Award for Advancing Institutional Equity and Inclusion at UC Berkeley. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Jens Manuel Krogstad. Jens is a senior writer and editor at Pew Research Center. He has authored or edited hundreds of studies on topics that include global migration, Latino public opinion, Hispanic demographic trends, and U.S. border enforcement. Prior to joining Pew Research Center, he had 9 years as a reporter at newspapers such as the Des Moines Register and USA Today, and is a graduate of the University of Minnesota. Panelists, thank you all so much for joining us today for this discussion. I'm going to start us off with a few questions, but I'd also like to invite everyone in our audience to please put your questions for our panelists in the chat, which is now open. We will be monitoring the chat throughout this discussion, and we really look forward to incorporating your questions throughout our discussion as we go. So please don't hesitate to speak up, to write up, I suppose, in the chat. Okay, great. So if you don't mind, Cristina, maybe I'll let you lead us off. And given that you're a leading expert in the history and development of the Hispanic category in the United States, can you give us a brief overview of how formal and informal recognition of this group has evolved over time, and specifically, where does the term Latinx come from?
Yeah, sure. That's a super long question that could take the entire time. But I think it's important to remember that initially the quest for even a panethnic category period came from the severe lack of data and ability to document, conditions of, racial injustice and social disadvantage, especially across the US-Mexico border, but also in areas like Spanish Harlem, Philadelphia, Rochester, places where sort of others, not just Mexicans, were living and also experiencing some of the lowest level of educational attainment and highest levels of poverty in America. And so, given that the Census Bureau was largely focused on classifying all of these populations as simply white or as mainly white, the lack of data really became a social justice issue, right? Over time, then lobbying to the data and sort of arranging, ways of negotiating some compromise of how would you actually create a data category evolved into what we have now, a sort of Hispanic / Latino, originally Hispanic / Spanish origin category, right? which was imperfect, but allowed some of these activists to then use the data to make claims, like, for example, on bilingual education, on Spanish language job training programs, and a bunch of anti-poverty programs, right? So we get this sort of imperfect negotiated category that essentially what it does is it takes in many ways the Mexican and Puerto Rican condition and generalizes it to a broader subset, right? Cuban Americans are now sort of seen as part of this broader umbrella. And in some ways it works as sort of Central American migration continues and places like East Los Angeles become much less Mexican and more Mexican and Salvadoran and Guatemalan. Many of these groups are experiencing the same social conditions brought about by a history of exploitation and deportation and expendability. But there are also really important differences. We know historically that the Cuban experience and their context of reception has differed starkly from even the Puerto Rican or the Mexican situation, right? And yet we all have this imperfect category that, however imperfect, has historically also served as one of the biggest tools in the arsenal for racial justice and social justice amongst Latino communities. I think sort of that starts the first way of thinking about it, how sort of a project for social justice evolved into an imperfect data category that is still a tool for what is used, right? But then, of course, when you create a category, you also have to sort of define it. What does it look like? Who's in it? How are they different from other categories? And this is where you've gotten the important role of media institutions, not just Latino media institutions, but also mainstream media, how they are thinking about who Latinos are and things like that. And so over time, when you've got so many categories, you've got so many stakeholders from the state to market media, to sort of activists on the ground, defining and investing in a category becomes less and less definable. In some paradoxical way, Latinidad is both hard to describe, hard to sort of say what it is, yet we all know what it is. Yet when you ask someone that's not Latino, what are the main racial groups in America, they will say white, Black, Latino, and Asian. Right? The American psyche is already institutionalized, right? That we know it's Hispanic/Latino. And yet Latino, just like all categories, I would argue, are diverse. There's all kinds of people. I mean, 30% of the Latino population is born outside of the United States, right? There's different levels of class mobility, there's different nationalities, there's different sexual orientations, skin tones, religious affiliations, so much diversity. And the way I sort of think about it when folks ask me about Latinx is when you think about the history of this category, with so much diversity, why would we think that only one label would suffice for all times, right? And even if you look at the history of the category, it's always had different labels. When it originally emerged, folks were saying, should we call it raza? Should we call it brown? Should we call it Latin American, Hispano, Hispanic, Spanish speaking, Spanish origin, Spanish surname? The list goes on. And so in different moments in time, we've had debates about new sort of labels and what they might mean. Latino was important for the 1980s and 1990s, thinking about the basis of Latinidad as not necessarily one that prioritizes Spain and Spanish culture, but maybe one that could be focused on the decolonial project or even just a geographic project of Latin America. And so you've gotten such rich diversity, right, and rich experiences. And so you've gotten rich debates. If you're a sociologist, you might think that categories are socially constructed and identities are fluid. And if we think that, then we might think that one label shouldn't need to be static and shouldn't need to be the label for all time to understand this, right? And that things can change. And that's exactly what has happened since 2012. It's hard to always pinpoint when a new label or when a new source of identity happens, but we can basically gauge that around 2012, there was a really important shift in the generational trends of American, like everybody's gender politics. New terms like cisgender and transgender and non-gender binary come to term for all Americans, right? Not just Latinos. And so this then becomes a new politics and ways of thinking about what our identity identities are. And this then also translates and also takes place in the Latino community. And such Latino as a label just happens to be gendered, right? Just like the rest of the Spanish language. And so, among a subset of student activists that were really sort of focused on what the intersection between racial and ethnic politics and sexuality and gender politics look like, right? And so there in 2012, it started mainly on college campuses, this idea of sort of using Latinx and X as the idea that it doesn't sort of roll off the tongue. It's not easy to say, it's not easy, but it makes you stop. And it makes you stop and think about sort of the way that the languages and labels that we use can reinforce, informal cognitive discourses about how society should be. And here the X was used to sort of hit back against these sort of gender binaries, but also became more broadly as a way to hit back and sort of open a way of discussing homophobia, gender roles, patriarchy in the Latino community. And so this happens in 2012, and we know from the data, and probably Jens will tell us more, but we know from the data that this is a much more youthful movement, at least initially. And in some ways, at least initially, this was a much more educated movement, although that trend has been changing. Yeah. So I'll stop there.
I think that sets up a perfect segue to turn to you, Jens, next. I know this is a topic that Pew has done a lot of important research on. Can you give us a sense of, thinking about the incredible diversity that Cristina was talking about within the Latino community and the diversity of categories and labels and identities that appeal to people? What do you find in terms of how people are identifying today and what kind of particular demographic groups who seem to be more or less likely to prefer to the term Latinx over other identities?
Yeah, first off, I just wanted to thank Dr. Mora for her scholarship. I have a dog-eared copy of her book, Making Hispanics, and it's an essential read for anyone interested in this topic. And I regularly recommend it when giving presentations on our Hispanic identity research. So definitely go out and get the book if you're into this sort of thing. Our National Survey of Latinos is a nationally representative bilingual survey of Latino adults. Pew Research Center has been conducting it for about 20 years. And this particular survey, where we asked about Latinx, focused on exploring awareness and use of the term Latinx rather than measuring positive or negative views toward the term, which I think you see a lot of that sort of debate on social media, especially. I see that all the time, and in news articles and opinion columns. But our survey really focused on awareness and use. And the survey found that about a quarter of Latino adults had heard of Latinx, and just 3% had used the term. And as you alluded to, there are certain groups of Latinos who are more likely to say they have used Latinx. The increased usage is really almost entirely centered on young Latinas, young Hispanic women ages 18 to 29. 14% of this group said they had used Latinx to describe themselves, compared with just 1% of Hispanic men of the same age, young Hispanic men. And no other age group rose above 2% in usage. So it really was about young Hispanic women, young Latinas using this, using Latinx. And this could in part reflect some education trends we see among young Latinos. One area where Latinx is used more often is on college campuses, for example. And we know the data shows that more Hispanic women than Hispanic men have attended college. And in 2019, women made up a significantly higher share of Latino college students than men. It was like 56% to 44%. And so, but it's also important to note that this gender gap in college enrollment is seen across all racial and ethnic groups. And as far as general preferences for terms, we've asked about this of Hispanic identity terms. We've asked about it in a few different ways. One way is to ask about which term people use to describe themselves most often. Country of origin, Hispanic or Latino, or a term like American. And when you ask it that way, by far the most popular response is country of origin. So about half of Latinos in our survey say that they most often use their country of origin, like Mexican or Cuban, to describe their Hispanic identity. And then the next largest group is Hispanic or Latino. And only about 10–12% say American. You can also ask about preferences between Hispanic and Latino. And when you ask it that way, Hispanic is slightly more preferred than Latino, but again, a lot of people don't have a strong opinion on it. About half of Latinos said they don't have a preference between the terms. And so that just kind of gives you an overview of where things stand in terms of what Latinos think about some of these various Hispanic identity terms.
It's so interesting to think about the intersectional nature of these identity terms and the evolution of how, we've even talked about all these different identities coming together, which is something I want to try to come back to later. But first, Jens, you hinted at the debates playing out, in the political debates around this term, which maybe it sounds like are not necessarily being reflected in the ways that the general public, the general Latino public that you're surveying is not necessarily talking about these terms in the ways that we see it playing out in politics and the media. Graciela, I'm really curious to hear from you what you see as the role of the news media in terms of shaping our conversations and our understandings or perhaps misunderstandings about the term Latinx, and where you see that kind of conversation going.
Thank you. So I just want to just add my voice to say how much I admire Cristina's book and how it opened my eyes. So I'm just here, I'm here just to listen to Cristina talk. No offense to Jens, but we've talked together, in the past.
I think we have the same approach to today.
Right. I really, that research really opened my eyes to how to correctly frame this conversation and what it is for and why it's important. But when it comes to news media, I think it's important to say also that there's no one news media sector in this country. It's a very, again, diverse and large industry. There's a lot of sectors within. So Spanish language media is one very important sector for a group of the Latinx community. Univision was instrumental in getting people to adopt the Hispanic label as an individual identity or a groupal identity or a social identity, I'd say. And again, Cristina is the one who taught me this through her book. And, I do a lot of research as the executive director of the Center for Community Media. And, in my role as in the bilingual program and the Latino Media Initiative, I've done a lot of research on content analysis and how Spanish language media in particularly covers the different Latino communities and also other communities of color. And what we found is that Latinx is is not used very frequently. Hispano and Latino is more used. And we found that in mainstream media, if I can generalize mainstream media as the media that pretends to serve or purports to serve a general market that is everybody in this country, which we know is not true. Mainstream media also serves segments of the audience or the public in different cities and in this country. What I've seen is, and it's been very interesting, how mainstream media, as they struggle with their own acute diversity problems, which basically means there's mainstream media is still across the board dominated by white, voices and white leadership, and there's the representation of people of color in mainstream media is just horrible. It's terribly low. It's not representative of the social fabric of this country. And if data is very scarce and it's not complete because most newsrooms don't reveal, they're not transparent on this data, but what we know that the numbers and the representation of Latinos in news media is probably worse now than it was in the 70s when this became part of the conversation, when there was a big push for diversify news media. And those numbers for women and people of color and Latinx people have gone down. So it's less, apparently it's around 77% or so in mainstream media organizations. So there's very few Latinx journalists within the mainstream media outlets who can actually explain any of this nuance to their editors and colleagues. So, and there's, in the past few years, there's been this push for diversification, and in news media, we saw Latinx, there's a jump in the use of Latinx after the Pulse massacre, remember, in Orlando, when there was, for the first time, coverage about LGBTQ Latinx communities and how this was an attack against those two identities in that community. And so that was the first time that for a lot of journalists in this country, this was even a reality and they had to deal with that. And what I've seen is there's a lot of fear and kind of cluelessness on how to approach this and which words to use. There's a lot of, genuine interest and curiosity on how to name people and communities. It's such a segregated country that, for a lot of journalists who come from white middle class communities, there's no connection with other communities. And so there's a lot of fear and a lot of lack of experience of, there's a lack of understanding and knowledge about these communities. So a lot of people, what I see is they walk on eggs and they're like, should I use this word? Am I offending someone? Is this, and I always, when I get the question, it's like, okay, do you want to know because you need to make a political decision here, or you just don't want to be attacked in Twitter? If this is about covering, your back, that's one conversation. If it's about really changing the narrative on Latinx communities and really covering this population in a way you've never done it, then that's another conversation. I think we've seen, and I think this is also relevant, we've seen a lot of research coming from outlets. The last one, the Philadelphia Inquirer this week, and there's, the LA Times last year, or at the beginning of I think it was last year, 2020. The Kansas Star did it in 2021. There's been a lot of kind of mea culpas and research kind of interrogating the racist coverage of communities of color by a lot of these newspapers and metro papers and local publications. And you see that there's been this pernicious, use of language to keep communities marginalized and to actually, not just, it's not a neutral role. It's a, there's a lot of data showing how the use of a specific language to name communities of color have actually helped not just the marginalization, but sometimes, even murder or, lynchings, etc. So I think there's a big responsibility in to educate ourselves as journalists. And I think the final point I will make is that has become, the Latinx label particularly has become part of the political polarization in this country, and how, if you publish, I use Latinx, I write in my columns in the New Yorker, every time Latinx is in the headline, because people who attack the term, I don't think they read the stories, but if the X is in the headline, the first thing is like this long, endless list of DMs and emails and comments in Twitter just attacking. And I've been just doing my own kind of survey and math. And so it's usually men who are not Latinx or don't look and don't have names that I could identify Latinx. I don't know how they identify themselves, but it's always middle-aged or older. So, and it's always like the same language is don't stop using Latinx. It always starts with this sentence, stop using Latinx. And then, it becomes insulting sometimes. And if you go to those accounts in Twitter, for example, they have very few, it's like 2 followers, 70 followers, 40 followers. So I was just actually talking to someone in Twitter saying, are these bots? Are these real people? Because it's like an orchestrated, and that happens to everyone in media when you use, and this study this past year, that was not the case before. So there's like an orchestrated campaign that is connected to, conservative movements against the use of Latinx. And I just hope they don't win.
Well, I hope that by having this conversation, right, we're at least taking a stand of not letting that be silenced. I'm curious, I saw Cristina and Jens, I saw your heads nodding as Graciela was speaking. I could imagine that both of you also get approached by people saying like, what term am I supposed to use? And I'm curious, what your take on that conversation is, and what your, if you're willing to share kind of what your approach to that is. And also, if you're willing to talk about, if you experience similar pushback in terms of trying to have this public conversation about terminology that is really important and that is political, right? I'm curious what your experiences have been with that.
Yeah, I can jump in first. I think I was just talking about this with our director, Dr. Lopez, and one thing that's I think sometimes easy to lose sight of is that a lot of people don't spend a lot of time thinking about identity terms like your average person. And so just because there's a lot of loud voices on Twitter doesn't necessarily reflect kind of broader reality, broader thoughts that people have around identity terms. That said, identity, anything related to identity is highly personal. And a lot of times people have very strong opinions about it, and they should. And so the way we approach it at the Pew Research Center is we just ask people to tell us how do you identify, what terms do you prefer? And there's no really right or wrong answer. It's all about how you view your own identity. And it's okay if it changes over time. We see that a lot too. And I often will use whatever term seems to be most appropriate in the situation I'm in, because I think Dr. Mora had mentioned that the Latino population in the US is incredibly diverse. So if you're being asked by a Latino group to talk about your Latino research, you might be getting all sorts of different groups with different viewpoints and backgrounds, and they might be coming at it from a lot of different ways. So just on a personal level, it's kind of flexibility is key. You kind of want to meet people where they're at, so they kind of listen to you and your data.
A few things. One is, I wish when journalists call me, I now wish this so much more all the time. Now I wish when journalists called me, they were calling me about, I don't know, the disparities in, Latinx, BA rates, the, high rates of poverty in the RGV, the relationship between Latinos and police brutality, officer-involved shootings, the lack of sort of public health data that we still don't have about Latinos, such that we can't even coin something like a Latinx COVID death crisis, which is real and will affect generations of Latino communities for decades to come, right? But it seems to me that we want to talk about labels. And, I almost always use that as an entry point to remind them that we've always had many labels. This is endemic, not just because we are so diverse, but we also operate within a system of racial inequalities, right? And it's important to figure out how we're going to talk about ourselves, because it's also important to point out these really systemic differences, right? So I think about that one. I think the second thing I think about is you see this shift, like you see people are using Latinx, then a whole we shouldn't use Latinx because your grandma can't use it, right? Or because only 3% are using it, although I think it often depends on what data set you're looking at, what region you're looking at, and if you're sort of looking at those born in the US or not born in the US or in California. So I see a shift between let's use it, let's not use it, let's do this. I generally say, as an educator, as a writer, we need to shift from is it right or is it wrong to it's just interesting. It's a really important, interesting political movement. And that, by the way, is not just particular to Latinos in the United States. History is replete with younger generations champion new visions, new politics, new identities, and new sort of labels about groups, right? Ideas like Black is beautiful, Black power, yellow power were all sort of ideas and politics from a new generation, right? And so we continuously see this. And so I think that youthful movements are often easily discounted by older generations. And I think this is what Graciela was talking about, right? But in reality, if we look at American history, they have been the engine of different ways of thinking about racial inequality in the United States. So I'd caution people to just sort of dispel it based on whatever numbers of how popular it is or not. I think it has opened up really interesting conversations with journalists. I think one of it is like, you know, that are about generational differences. You know, conversation with, I think, a USA Today journalist was about sort of us talking about, so what is it, what happens if your grandma doesn't use it, right? One argument is don't use Latinx because it doesn't connect across generations or doesn't connect across with the Americas and Spanish and stuff like that. And one way to see this is, well, yeah, that's the purpose, is to disrupt this, right? But another way to think about it is, do you think the way your grandma thinks? Do you want to use the terms there, right? And it can offer the opportunity to engage in what it was supposed to be about. You know, most articles are about who uses it, who doesn't use it, and who is upset about it, and much less about what it was intended, which is rethink gender politics. You know, think seriously about the role of machismo, homophobia, patriarchy within the Latino community. And if we could use those to have an opportunity for these conversations instead of, is it right, is it wrong, does it roll off the tongue, does my grandma use it? I think I'd be much more happy. So in some ways, I fear that we might have a missed opportunity here, you know, to really engage in sort of these deep conversations that can happen, but they're also hard to happen. And Twitter is a place where hot and fast takes don't allow often for these much more in-depth conversations. And so, you know, I worry about that a little bit more. So at the end of the day, I generally say, I'm happy if we can move away from the judgment of it, the interesting of it, and towards sort of the space of the original intention. Let's talk about gender binaries and gender politics here. And I think when we're not doing that, we do a disservice in these ways.
Absolutely. And I love to start seeing some questions come up in the chat, but I would love to follow that thread and open that up to all of our panelists. You know, I think one of the common themes that's coming across this discussion is thinking about how the term Latinx lets us start to really think intersectionally about the Latino community and about inequality, right, within the Latino community. And I'm curious if any of you have thoughts about how our evolving language, you know, kind of picking up on what Cristina was just saying, is bringing those inequalities to light. You know, also thinking about, Graciela, what you mentioned earlier about the Pulse shooting massacre, right? How does using the terminology let us start to really have these important conversations?
Yeah, I can take a crack at that. Our research shows that, as I kind of touched on earlier, Latinos who use Latinx tend to be younger, and they also tend to have higher levels of education, and often are born in the US. And that's in contrast to older Latinos who are more likely to be immigrants, Spanish speaking or Spanish dominant, and tend to have lower levels of education compared to other groups of Latinos. So there are some demographic differences between those who use Latinx and those who don't. And there may be an intersection. It seems like there's an intersection with political views. We haven't measured that, but that seems to be the case. And one thing I wanted to point to in terms of the meaning of Latinx and why it came about in the first place, there was a recent piece, I'm curious what people think about it, from LA Times columnist Jean Guerrero, and she argued that people should stop claiming that white liberal elites created the term Latinx. She quoted Representative Ruben Gallego, a Democrat from Arizona, and he put it that the term is meant to appease white rich progressives. And the column itself came out shortly after the civil rights group LULAC said it would not use the term in official communications. So there's this kind of backlash, and it's all about white rich progressives. But Guerrero rightly points out that the roots of Latinx can be traced to the early 2000s and even perhaps to the 1990s as a term used by queer Latinxes. And And so for some people, this gender neutral term is a meaningful step toward inclusion that really reflects the diversity of the Latino, Hispanic, Latinx population in this country. And that kind of circles back to what Dr. Mora was talking about in terms of having a conversation about why this term came about and why it matters.
I mean, one way to think about a missed opportunity is, you know, I teach classes, right? Or we're educators, or we write books, or what have you. And one wonders, like, what is research for? Like, what is this purpose for, right? And the things I write and the things I want to teach about are often for precisely these things. So college students can go home and talk to their parents about all kinds of things that have affected the Latino community, from sort of the high rates of lynching across the Southwest border to patriarchy to sort of, you know, all kinds of issues, right? And so, you know, this is a real moment and this is a real opportunity. Unfortunately, it's sort of covered with the right or the wrong. The like judgment aspect of it, that's a little difficulty. I mean, you couple this also with, and Graciela might know more about this, you couple this with sort of the media moment and sphere in which we live in which sort of massive amounts of misinformation, the scale of which we don't even know about on Spanish language media, you know, through WhatsApp, through Twitter, through all kinds of format, you know, are endemic, and we don't know about these. So conspiracies like these, you know, can really sort of circle out of hand this way. I think it's also connected to, you know, at some root, conversations about patriarchy or sexism or homophobia are uncomfortable for some, right? And we've known that, and you see the trends by education, by class and things like that. And so there's certainly might be a group that would be incredibly uncomfortable and averse. And if we could just get rid of Latinx, then maybe we get rid of, or we can make a laughing stock out of them, or we can minimize them, or we can say it's only 3 people and her friends, you know, that allows for that. And so, you know, I think it's messy. And I think that, you know, these things will go on unless we call them out. So I actually think the piece from the LA Times was actually pretty brave, right? Just like the pieces that are about, you know, even if it is only 3%, that's actually more than the people that have green eyes in the United States, right? And so things like that, at what level can we open these things up? And I tend to think generally when folks ask me about this, I tend to think code switching is real. In sociology or in social sciences, we'd like to think that identities come with like a whole toolkit. Like we have a whole collection or a repertoire of different labels that we're often using to think and talk about ourselves, and identities are fluid. And I might say I'm Chicana in one room, and then I'll say I'm Mexican in another room, and I'll sometimes use Latinx or Latina in another room. And I think that's totally fine. And seeing Latinx as something that is not necessarily an entire, you know, that's not mutually exclusive with Latino, that people that say Latinx can also say that they're Latino, and they do it often, you know, is important, because there are different situations and we're like real human beings. We're not robots that just use one label all the time, right? And so seeing things in that context is also important.
Yeah, I noticed when I talk with, I'm sorry, go ahead, Graciela.
No, go. I can wait.
I'm sorry. Just really quick, I do notice a certain amount of insecurity among Latino audiences when I'm presenting our research in terms of what terms should I use. I'm this certain background. Am I Latino, or am I Latino enough? Or people aren't quite sure, since it's such a large term. They're having trouble sorting through how to think about Latino identity, and maybe is kind of working through being comfortable with some of that fluidity and kind of the multiples of identity that you can have and how it can change according to the situation. So I definitely see that in conversations with people.
Yes, I was going to say something different, but I like to say something about that. And I think that what makes people more, a lot of people defensive about it is when they feel this label is being imposed on them individually. And this is not the point. This is not why these labels are created. These are not for individual identity. These are for, as Cristina explained, these are for, for population, for civil rights, for social rights, they have to do with, just identifying a population just so that they can have the rights that have been denied to them, or, that's why the government uses this and the census uses this. But I feel like people feel like there's some people that get very defensive, and I think some of the coverage is also misleading, because it's like, you have to, if you don't identify like this, so this is your identity, and it's not. So when Jens is saying you ask individuals how they identify, we, of course, journalists do the same. The thing is, when you're talking about, issues, or, poverty, or, the impact of COVID-19, or, labor rights, whatever, then you're not going to go ask everybody. I mean, it's a political decision which language label you're using, and also it's so that was one thing. But what I wanted to say is, I think this conversation in terms of when it touches misinformation and polarization, it's really, I think it goes parallel to the conversation around the Latino vote. I've seen that the whole, first, how many times can a Latino journalist go, on TV and say Latinos are not a monolith? I mean, really, it's become like this cliche, but it doesn't get us anywhere, because then the next interview is exactly the same conversation. And so now everybody repeats that, because it's like, okay, now we know these Latinos are not a monolith, but how are they voting Republican? It's impossible. So you're like, wait, what is this conversation? Like, wait, and it really connects. Remember, there was this survey a few months ago at some Democratic pollster, I don't remember where. They did this survey showing that 40% of Latinx, 40% of Hispanics, they said, or Latinos, reacted aggressively or kind of very defensive. They hated the word Latinx, and they would never vote a candidate who used the word Latinx. And so this got a huge coverage. Everyone, NBC, the TV, everyone, the New York Times, everybody covered this story. And I was like, what is so fascinating about this story? If you looked at the data, actually what it showed is that 60% of the people interviewed didn't care one way or the other. And then 40% were either bothered by the word or really strongly hated that, and they would not vote for somebody who used that. And it actually, the percentage is kind of aligned with the political divide within the population, because it's something between 30 and 40% who would vote Republican and who have, have more conservative views. And then a majority who did not care. But the conversation was not about the majority who didn't care. It was about the percentage. And so there was a lot of coverage saying, politicians should not use this word anymore, because that is what is pushing Latinos to vote for Trump and it's the same conversation. There's this lack of interest in going deeper and being nuanced and understanding the reality. Is like just such a superficial, I feel, conversation, but I don't see this going any deeper. And I feel like people, like when experts, when they're invited by mainstream media, particularly, to discuss these things, the questions are they still the same questions, as if the answers were not being heard.
One thing, if I could just jump in to say, is I'd be remiss if I didn't, though, point out to the important ways that labels matter, and that labels have power. So on the one hand, yes, people have all kinds of different labels. And at the same time, labels have this sort of unconscious, subconscious power, right? To convey things and reinforce certain types of power relations in society. And so, just like there was a push for, understanding what you're doing when you're using Hispanic versus Latino, for example, in the 1990s, Doesn't mean that everybody has this in their head as they're using it, right? Most people are just sort of using what's around. But that doesn't negate the fact that there are cultural powers to labels. And there's been some really great, interesting new research that came out a couple of months ago by the Race and Politics Lab at UCLA, led by the fabulous Efren Perez and his research team, that actually found that, you know, folks that are using Latinx has actually sort of come to adopt more gender inclusive views. That there are ways in which sort of the usage and the continued usage of this also then can shift your way you think about sort of gender in ways that are just not about correlations, but actually effects. And so I think that's been incredibly interesting and sort of gets lost in this whole, like, you know, broader, is it right or is it wrong sort of sense of debate. Yeah, I mean, so on the one hand, yes, we have different labels, and on the other hand, okay, meet your audience where they're at, and also understand that labels are not power neutral, right? They're also communicating these ways. And so it's almost in the same way as we're always sort of towing this line of, on the one hand, yes, Latinos have real aggregate pattern differences that are often connected to issues of racial justice and social disadvantage that are real. And they're also diverse, you know. I tend to think of, you know, can we live in a both and instead of either or world? You know, can we just please do that? It would make sort of my life as sort of, you know, not only just a Latina scholar, but a, you know, Latinx studies scholar too. You know, if we, you know, I feel like we're constantly saying, you know, there are these really important patterns that unite us. And there are real sort of differences, and, you know, be more complex, America. I know it. I know you have the ability to think in nuanced ways.
We're getting some great questions in the chat. One of them is, I think, picking up on some of the things we were just talking about, asking how are new identity labels and categories, like how do they come to be? What is the kind of the social process? I think we've hinted a little bit, right, at the power, you know, thinking about like of youth in particular, potentially to be generating some of this social change and pushing for change via new identities. Wondering if any additional thoughts on like how these identities come to be and what that kind of social process looks like.
So sorry again. I was busy putting the study in the chat. Are you asking like how Latinx came to be and what that process was, or?
You know, the
how
question
labels
broader.
come to be. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, maybe just kind of like the broader kind of social movement process of these labels coming to be.
Yeah, I think the youth. I think generation matters. We see that in the United States, you know, generational politics. You saw that in summer 2020. You saw that in summer 1969. You continue to see the labor movement. These are youthful, engaged, you know, youth. You see that climate change movements, like all of this, right? In the United States, an engine of difference is often college students, it's often high school students, it's often in these places where new utopias and visions, ideas of a new future of what could have been and what can be emerge, right? This is a moment in people's times and their development in which they are resisting that of the past. You've seen this very particularly in sort of Latino history, when you sort of got a push against Spanish, a push against the Mexican American generation, the evolution of a Chicano and Boricua politics. This is you, but it's just not just us. It's every group, and it's many, many issues. And so I think youth labels are really important. And then you see at each moment in time, the backlash. This is not new. This is not new. This is, you know, textbook American history, right? And it might be textbook global history, right? And so I think that, you know, I tend to teach a very classic text in sociology by Karl Mannheim, The Sociology of Generations, right? And just how there's this real thing about cohorts and when you sort of come of age, and there's this really special period of sort of, of youth where you are adopting new labels and pushing back against your parents and things like that. And I don't discount that. I think that's real. And I think we see that. And youth use different and new tools, like they use social media now much more, in different ways. When I think about, I know folks often want to think about the future, like, is this real? Is this going to last? Or things like that. I tend to just put out my sociology card and say, we're not really good at predictions about the future. All I can say is it feels real to certain people, and it feels like it's connected to their identity so ingrained. I think that if it's going to be institutionalized and be real, it'll have to be adopted by the state, by state agencies. It's not something that can just live in people's discussions and in, academic lingo. It would have to be adopted by the state. And, it's hard to tell what moves states, the Census Bureau, to make changes. And if they do, it's very slow. Right. And so those are the things I think about, but I don't discount the real engine of social change, period, that is sort of, the 15 to 25-year-old, age range, when people are coming of age and, adopting their identities in ways that's often against their parents and what is it now? Okay, boomer, like real sort of things that exist in society that tell us that generational and cohort differences are real for the way we think of ourselves and our politics.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and
Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to just mention couple quick things. Just in a globally connected world, these debates about gender roles and using gender inclusive language is something we're seeing internationally, and it reflects conversations and debates and movements we're seeing in Latin America as well. Mexico is something I'm pretty familiar with, and there's been marches and protests and women standing up for women's rights and marching in Mexico City. And so it's Latinx, it's much bigger than Latinx. You have, I think, a commenter mentioned about terms like Latine, and this is not the first time debates over the gendered Spanish language have gone on in Latin America either. This is kind of an old debate in a certain way. And then the other thing I just had to chime in on, because Dr. Moore had mentioned about state use of language, and Census Bureau is something we study a lot about. So I wanted to be sure to mention that the Census Bureau did look at changing how it measures race and ethnicity, and actually made a recommendation in 2017 to change the census form to make it more inclusive and kind of allow people to express their identity, their racial and ethnic identity, in a more nuanced way. But they made that recommendation in around 2017, and the Trump administration didn't act on it. They never said, why, or they'd never commented on it. It just kind of sat on a desk and didn't go anywhere. And so the Census Bureau is always conducting community meetings and always looking at how the census can better reflect how people are thinking about their own identity. And today people are increasingly expecting to see themselves represented in the world, on TV shows, movies, and on census forms. And so the census, and one of the most common ways that Hispanics identify their race on the census form is actually not in any of the single race categories like white, black, or American Indian. It's some other race is the most common one, and also checking multiple races. So a lot of Latinos are not seeing the way they think about their race on the census form, and the Census Bureau found a way they thought they'd found a good solution for the 2020 census, and they just asked people which category best describes you. It was interesting that the new question didn't even mention the word race. They just said, which category describes you, mark all the boxes. And they had a section for white and Hispanic, Latino. And for each of these groups, there were a number of subgroups, so people could give a detailed answer. Cuban and Hispanic, Mexican and Latino, or Black and African American, Black and Jamaican, and to kind of really allow people to tell this government how they think about themselves. So we are, and so there are some changes that have been proposed. When it takes a long time, definitely, as Dr. Mora mentioned, they studied this for like almost a decade before making their recommendations. So if Latinx ever makes it onto a census form, it'll probably be the 2030 or 2040 census, because they are trying to satisfy everyone in the best way they can. And it's a very, very difficult thing when it comes to racial and ethnic identity terms.
And it won't happen if there's not really a social movement behind it, and a social movement behind it will be hard to coalesce if we're stuck in a right and wrong,
I see another question in the chat. I'm curious if any thoughts about the role of social media. We've talked about the news media in particular, but also, talked about, right, even just our own experiences, the interactions we have on social media, but the way that social media might be a tool that helps, spread the growing use of terms, and also, maybe pushes back on some of the flattening, right, of this conversation, and in a positive way allows for more nuance. I'm curious if any of you, have thoughts about the role of social media in all of this.
I would just say, social media is a very fragmented universe, and people are kind of in their own, it's very easy to find yourself just talking to people who agree with you in social media, and then, then finding these, other ideas as completely outrageous or foreign. But I'd say there's a pressure by people of color and young people through social media on news media and on organizations and institutions and elite institutions. So what I followed with a lot of interest is in the past few years, these movements expressing themselves through a conversation in social media that, even targeting, some language or some ideas or some columnists, some outlets for either, be stereotyping people or communities, or for, spreading ideas that are, damaging to communities. So I think, and I know that, mainstream media outlets and editors and take this very seriously, and there's a lot of fear of being, called out in social media for using a wrong word, or for saying something that is offensive to other communities. So, and I think a lot of young people who are on social media, they know that there's a small power there to change some things, and at least, including language.
Yeah, and I would say it's a little difficult, because as it can be a tool for expressing an idea, you can also have, it's used across all generations and across the political spectrum now. So you can have these campaigns on the left or the right. And I think when some of that happens, this is my concern. My concern is, yes, on the one hand, it can allow to sort of put forth ideas that would have been marginalized, out there, a much bigger platform than they could have had, which is good. By the nature of social media, though, too, it can flatten an issue that's much more complicated and has much more nuance. It's easy to just sort of disregard. It's easy to say, to mock something, or without sort of saying and giving the gravity of what it is, right? It's hard to do that in 140 characters, right? Or point to the volumes of academic studies that might support, one sort of way of, one sort of arrived at, conclusion by the vast majority of, academics that have studied something, and just sort of easily, dismiss it, right? And so I think that's where the worry comes from. So you see it with on both ends in that way, and that makes it incredibly complicated. Yeah.
I think we're nearing the end, and so I want to pose a final question. We've touched on this a little bit, but I want to make sure I give each of you a chance to add anything else you might want to say. Thinking about where do we go from here, right? I think we've one of the central themes has been saying, like, we need to move past this initial the tired conversation of what is the right or wrong term to use, and instead to be really thinking a lot more carefully about what the conversation should be. So I'm curious if any of you have, kind of last thoughts you want to share with us about what are the pressing issues or questions that you see as really central to scholarship and public debate on this topic.
From a news media point of view or a journalism point of view, I actually would like to see more conversation on other issues. I agree with what Cristina was saying, and I've been thinking also about that. Why, we train at CUNY, we train our bilingual journalists on really changing the narrative on the communities and the work. There's of course no shortage of stories and topics and issues that are important, but not just about hardship, but about triumph and everything, anything that that's covered and that for other communities and for whatever used to be mainstream in this country. You can find those. So in my case, I think I like to see less conversations about these labels and more, even though, as I said, I think it's very important, and I believe language is political, and I think this conversation about identity is very important. But I like to see more coverage and a different type of coverage on Latinx communities altogether.
At the Pew Research Center, we really we lean into nuance and complexity. So I would say anything that can really illuminate the diversity of Latinos in the US in new and different ways. I think there's a lot that we can do more about kind of the gendered experience, the experience of Latinas, of Hispanic women versus Hispanic men and Latinos on any number of different issues, just a very extremely broad topic. I think also Latinx and how it intersects with politics, exploring a little more exactly what the political views of Latinos. So, there was a lot of talk after the 2020 election about Latino Republicans and Latinos who voted for Trump, but find out more about who they are, what they think. We put out a new political typology report that found that Latinos were actually more likely than other racial and ethnic groups to not have as strong ties to one of the two major parties, to Republicans or Democrats. They were much more likely to have weaker ties. And so that's something I want to explore more, is what does that mean? What does that mean? What are the implications for politics and policy? And so off the top of my head, those are just a couple of things.
Yeah, and I guess I would say, everything, I think Graciela and Jens have sort of pointed to, can we just have more? Can we just have more and more diverse things? And I think what is communicated there, something really critically important, is sort of invisibility, right? It's like, how do you get to become 20% of the population and you're so invisible in all these spaces? In the discourse on racial justice, in the discourse on, public health and who has medical access, police brutality, all kinds of things, the future of the nation, right? How does that happen? And the more I think about it, the more I think, like, if I were to think of what's one thing that's tying these groups is systemic, invisibility in all these ways. And I think the more stuff we have, like, just the more, and I'm an academic, so, I will forever and a day, think about Latino studies and think about the fact that there haven't been new Latino studies departments founded since 2000, even though it's 2022, right? And even though sort of population shifts, are real. And so I think part of that sort of a reckoning with sort of everyone wants to be recognized, and yet there's systematic differences in sort of the amount of oxygen given to different issues. And, and then if you think of within the community, the amount of oxygen given to different ideas, like, why is there so much on Latinx and so little on the COVID death crisis, right? And that, to me, as a researcher, is maddening. I don't have the data sets. I don't have the data sets, and Jens knows that he doesn't have the data sets, and we don't have the stories, and we don't have the journalists, and we don't have this and that. And that sort of then means that our students don't have the conversation with their grandmas and things like that. So I don't know. I see this all as completely interconnected. And I see it not just give us more, but to reckon with what is the power of invisibilization or invisibility, right? In the way we think about national conversations. Tend to think it's so odd to me. Latinos are so visible as 20% of the population, as people fret about what's the browning of America look like and who's taking over who, and yet so invisible at the same time.
I think that's a really powerful note to end on, and a call to all of our students and colleagues on this call today with us to be thinking about how do all of us answer that call, right? And how do we bring that into our research and our practice, and how do we as an institution at WashU do, right? We are an institution that does not have a Latinx studies department or program yet either. So if those are issues that are speaking to you in our audience, I encourage you to reach out to me or to Leo Cabasa. The two of us are actually the co-chairs of a steering committee through the Center for Race, Ethnicity, and Equity here at WashU, working on these issues, and we would love to hear your voice and to amplify that voice. There's Leo joining on the screen, and I'll put both of our emails in the chat. I want to thank our panelists so much for taking the time today to join us virtually from all different places to have this really engaging and important conversation. We are really grateful for your time today. And I don't think our audience will be able, you will hear our audience, but I know they're all joining me in thanking you so much for joining us and for doing this today. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you so much. It's been great. Thank you,
Pleasure.
everybody.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.
For your time today. Thank you.